Hey nerds, what's up? Today we're gonna do a part 2 of my strong female character video because you guys had so much interesting stuff to say that I really wanted to continue the conversation with your guys' comments and really allow the community to kind of see your guys' insight because there was so much good stuff. Let's get into your comments after the jump. I apologize in advance if I butcher any of your usernames or last names. I am going to do my best. So this first comment, I actually saw a lot of you made this comment, but I particularly liked how this one was stated. Kelly Sacato said, one potential way to show a greater range of strengths and talents in female characters would be to jettison the Smurfette Principle for good and create more stories that showcase different kinds of female characters with a variety of strengths. This was just a perfect way to state that. Yes, the more female characters we have, the better, because it shows a diversity. Now, for those of you who don't know what the Smurfette Principle is, it is officially defined as the tendency for works of fiction to have exactly one female amongst an ensemble of male characters, in spite of the fact that roughly half of the human race is female. Unless a show is purposefully aimed at a female viewing audience, the main characters will tend to be disproportionately male. You know, when you have more than one female character, it's not hard to have a flawed female character because then you're not speaking for the entire female race. You're just showing varied characters. It's so much easier to vary characters when there's actually variation. And this is particularly a problem in fantasy, which is obviously the basis of my channel, right? That's what I focus on. There is this perception that fantasy is generally advertised for a male audience, which is a video for another time. We don't have time to talk about that today. But because of that, we end up getting the Smurfette Principle a lot. If you just think of a lot of your favorite, even kid shows, fantasy shows, you'll notice this happens quite a bit. That's why I always say Misaki from The Sword of Kaigen is one of my favorite representations of motherhood, because the main character is a warrior, but she has two friends who are also mothers and very different in their feelings and attitudes towards motherhood, and none of them are ever played as weaker than the other or wrong or silly. They just are, and being able to see that many different representations of what motherhood could be like in one book is what makes it such a great representation, because there are many sides. One side isn't the right, it's not the only thing. Also, in conjunction with this, you guys keep reminding me of the horrible endgame scene.
Don't worry.
Or all the women come out, and just stop reminding me of that scene. Yes, that's the perfect example of like them trying to get rid of the Smurfette Principle, but just somehow like reinforcing it. I don't know how that happened. Another comment that many of you stated was summed up by this comment by Jason. I agree with all your points. To add another thought to this, the SFC now has very few feminine traits, if any. It feels like the writers' film industry is saying or can only see women as strong if they have mostly male traits. This was something brought up by probably like 50% of you. You guys really talked about this. And let me be clear, I think it's really important to see all versions of femininity, all versions of female expression are important, including the more typically masculine presenting ones. I think the problem comes in is when people feel that Hollywood is only presenting that one thing. It becomes boring, it becomes cliche, and it ends up not feeling very authentic. It's also important to realize that it's sexist to view typically feminine traits as weak, while typical male traits are viewed as strong. And it's important that this sexist view of feminine versus masculine traits also hurts men. That's where we have those issues where men aren't allowed to feel emotion, men aren't allowed to feel sad or grieve things because it's somehow seen as weak. That creates huge issues in breakdowns of communications and relationships, and breakdown of just being able to it's healthy to feel emotions. It's healthy to recognize those. And so this limiting of typical feminine traits weak, things like compassion or emotion or sadness, is first of all just only considered feminine, as if men can't have those emotions, but also viewed as weak, hurts everybody, and it hurts characters. Next, let's talk about this comment from Third Space Maker. I love their first point. They said, AP Canavan used a phrase the other day, I'm fairly certain it was in the discussion of a Star Trek Discovery episode with Steven Erikson, that sums of the proliferation of Katniss-like SFCs and Hollywood in general. A superficial copying of the events without any understanding of what made it interesting to begin with. I love that quote. That fits Katniss exactly. It's like they viewed Katniss and they're like, cool, chick with a bow, that's awesome. And like, didn't read the book or realize that she was strong because she was forced to be, and that she was miserable and had PTSD and was dealing with all of these emotions. That's the part that made Katniss interesting, along with her being such a strong and fierce competitor. And I love that idea of like Hollywood often misses the mark by not truly understanding what makes a character successful. And I think it's kind of something we saw in the Wheel of Time show, not to bring that up again. Okay, next I want to talk about 2 counterpoints that were brought up against my argument that I thought were very well made and very interesting. Now, I'm so sorry. The first one I could not find the original commentator for. I searched through the comments and couldn't find it, but someone talked about how they felt it was unfair to criticize Carol's backstory because this idea of someone just facing this constant sexism is true. It could happen. And they particularly said that that level of sexism in a soldier backstory would probably be true and happen, and everyone would tell her she couldn't do it. So I want to say I was worried that my video would come off like that and that people would misinterpret that I didn't think that was possible. I want to say I totally believe that backstory is possible. I'm a female engineer, and so I have experienced I know a little bit about it. You know, I wasn't a soldier, but I can relate to that little bit. So I never want it to feel like I was criticizing that no woman could, experience that level of sexism. I think where the breakdown in Carol's story comes from is that, first of all, they had to remind us of it so much, like they didn't trust their audience to just like get it, which was frustrating. I think the other problem was that the sexism against her became her only defining trait. Like if your only obstacle to overcome is external like that, is this sexism, and there is no internal struggle, that's when a character falls flat, and I think that's the problem with Carol. She needed something more than just the external sexism to drive her story. It was more the way that it was executed that made it fall into kind of that SFC category, in my opinion. The next counterpoint I want to bring up that I thought was really excellent was by Eric Koenig, and he says, however, what always rubs me the wrong way about this argument is how it seems to be interested on a deeper level with a woman's likability and agreeability as a character trait. I'm not accusing you of making that argument. You outlined the Mary Sue element more strongly, and poor storytelling as a complicating factor. However, when I see this argument that good female characters don't need to be intentionally demeaning, mean-spirited, emotionally closed off, and hyper-competent, I wonder why. Given that collectively, women who display these traits in the real world are often worse off for being so, there are studies of women in the workplace who speak up being seen as less agreeable simply for speaking up. It reads often as a reflection of entrenched cultural beliefs about what women should be, rather than what they are. Wow, I really, really love that comment, and I want to dissect it a little bit. You know what? They're completely right. There is a lot of evidence that women are way more often seen as aggressive for just speaking their mind, seen as aggressive for being overcompetent, and I can't deny that that is true, and that they're often disliked for those traits. And I think we have to deal with our own internalized sexism in that way that we often may not realize. We dislike women who show those traits when we don't dislike male characters who show that trait. So I really liked that comment, and I can't disagree with it. And I think it's a good counterpoint to what I'm saying. The one thing I'll defend when we're talking about it in Carol's case is the more I thought of this, I decided that we needed to compare Carol with Tony Stark. Because Tony Stark is the other kind of character who is hyper competent, very snarky, maybe mean-spirited at times. And so I thought, is it really just this internal sexism that Tony Stark is so beloved and Carol isn't? And as I thought about this, I saw one big difference. And the biggest difference is that none of the Iron Man movies force us or are trying to convince us that we should like Tony Stark. In fact, many characters in Iron Man tell Tony that he's arrogant and that they don't like him, and it's a very strong plot line that Tony is kind of unlikable. And when we contrast that with Carol, instead we're often being told how amazing she is and everybody else is wrong if they dislike her. I think another commenter who I couldn't find again, I'm sorry, pointed out that they thought it was really cheesy in one of the movies that they had Thor when he met Carol.
I like this one.
And you're like, why are you having to tell us that so much? And I think it's, again, the lack of commitment. There is a fear that if they have a character dislike Carol who's not a villain, then somehow it is demeaning the female character. Now, personally, I don't think how Carol was presented in her movie was dislikable. That's like, I liked Carol as a character. I just thought she was shallow. It's not like I disliked the movie. I kind of thought she was funny. I liked her snarky attitude. But I do think it's a very interesting thing to think about, the contrast between Tony and Carol and how they were treated in their respective stories. Tony definitely has an internal story, and his story isn't only about how other people perceive him. When we look at Carol, her story is more about this external narrative, and I think that's where we break down in this specific case. Anyway, I thought that was a really great counterpoint by Eric, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts continuing that counterpoint to the argument I make. I think it's a very good one. And kind of continue that discussion, talking about this and the Smurfette Principle and all of that. If you are really interested in that sort of discussion, I highly recommend a book I've already recommended on here before called Invisible Women: Data Bias in a World Designed for Men. There are many chapters that talk about some things adjacent to what we're talking about here. I loved that book and highly recommend it if you want to study that phenomenon further. Okay, next is another comment that multiple people talked about, but Joshua Templeton said it this way: "You forgot physically strong without looking it. An SFC weighing 120 pounds kicking a 250-pound man through a wall, etc." Absolutely. A lot of you talked about how all of our strong female characters happen to be tall, skinny, extremely conventionally attractive, and white. Now, in fairness, our male superheroes do not escape this. Apparently, a prerequisite of getting superpowers is being skinny, fit, tall, and really conventionally attractive. But I do like this idea of, they're very strong without any of the physical looks that would actually be present in a strong person. Like if you look at the female weightlifters in the Olympics, that's just an example because I watched those last Olympics, they have a certain body type that is very rarely represented when we see female strong, like physically strong characters on screen. I want to talk a little bit about Encanto. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, we've been talking about Encanto. Yes, this is a Disney movie and it's a kid movie, but I think there's some interesting things about it. Now, I couldn't for sure confirm this. This is just what I've seen from a lot of news outlets, so it might, take it with a little grain of salt, but it does seem to ring true. They talk about how the artist for Luisa, the strong character in the movie, the artist had to fight back on giving Luisa a strong look. If you see her final character design, she looks strong. She looks like someone who weightlifts. And the original Disney design for her was much more like a typical Disney princess, considering that her powers are magical. They did not want to make her look physically or typically strong, and the artist pushed back on that. Further on that is Disney has been supposedly surprised at how Luisa's merch is outselling almost all the other characters. People love her and they love her character design. Now, weirdly, I realize this is slightly against what we've been saying about typical masculine traits and how that is described as strong. I think where Encanto benefits in a few ways. One, we definitely don't have the Smurfette Principle, correct? We have a ton of different female characters with different perspectives, so it makes them all stand out. We can see them as separate beings and as a lot of different representations. Additionally, it's kind of nice to see a character who looks the way they'd probably look realistically. And also, I think something about Luisa feels very authentic as a physically strong person. She has a lot of internal struggles that I think are relatable to everybody, no matter what your gender is. And she's so different than what we've seen in Disney before. I think people really attached on to that. And I think it's such a good lesson for Hollywood to see that there is room for these different expressions. It seems like it's constantly surprising Hollywood that we like to see a different representation, but it's always popular when it happens. And I think, again, it's about that authenticity. Something about all the Encanto characters feel authentic that sometimes our female superheroes kind of missed the mark on. We're going to talk about the last two comments I have here, which are a little bit related. First from Joanna, which says, "While I don't disagree with you, I prefer the word complex or layered rather than strong. No one is one positive quality all the time, and exploring different layers is what fascinates me as a reader. I would also love to see more female friendship in fantasy and sci-fi more than anything." I've talked about before how much I wish I could see more female friendships in sci-fi and fantasy. That's a video for another time. But I absolutely love what she said about complex or layered, because while I was making the video, I was actually really struggling how to differentiate what I felt was the real strong female character versus our Hollywood strong female character. So I resorted to just using SFC in quotes to mean the fake one and saying strong female character to say the real one. Can we change it? Instead of FSC, can we say CFC? I love the idea of it being complex female character. That describes so much more what we really want to see. Strong isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about complex, we're talking about varied, we're talking about authentic. So I really loved that comment. Thank you, Joanna. And then Lisa Cook said, it seems Hollywood wants to give its female characters the traditionally male role of hero. So far, so good, but minus the hero's journey. A journey implies women have flaws, and we can't do that. Start instead with the premise that women are human, with all that implies. That's real feminism in my books. I love how she related it to the hero's journey. Yes, that's it. We are having problems with some of our SFCs going through the hero journey, which requires flaws and internal struggle. So I really enjoyed what she said there. Overall, thank you guys so much for engaging with me. I found this strong female character discussion so interesting. Let's change it to complex female character. That's what I'm going to ask us all to change. And let's continue the discussion in the comments below. Tell me if this gave you any new insights, and let's keep talking. As always, if you like these kind of videos, please like and subscribe. And if you want to check out what I'm currently reading or other nitty rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.